True War Encounters, Jake McNiece. Silent Resolve. The M1903 Springfield still smelled like the man who died holding it. Jake McNiece wrapped his fingers around the stock and tried not to think about the blood dried into the wood grain. June 1944, 3 kilometers west of Carentan, and the Normandy hedgerows had swallowed half the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment during the night drop. McNiece had spent 18 hours moving through Bocage country alone, navigating by compass and instinct, avoiding German patrols, searching for any sign of the filthy 13. What he found instead was a massacre in progress. The ruined Norman farmhouse sat in a shallow depression between two hedgerows, its stone walls pockmarked by weeks of shelling. The dairy barn behind it had burned down to blackened timber skeletons. Between them, a narrow stone corridor, maybe 30 meters long, barely wide enough for two men shoulder to shoulder, connected the two structures. And in that corridor, 8 paratroopers from his unit were pinned down, trapped by German riflemen, and at least one MG-42 covering every angle from the barn's rubble. McNiece had climbed into the farmhouse hayloft, pulled the Springfield from the dead scout's hands, and watched 2 men die trying to rush the corridor. The machine gun chewed them apart in seconds. Bodies lay twisted in the doorway. The June heat brought flies. He was a demolition man. TNT, primers, detonation cord, satchel charges rigged under bridges while tank treads rumbled in the distance. That was his language. Explosions were what he understood, but his demo kit was gone, lost somewhere in the chaos when his parachute tangled in an apple orchard and a German patrol nearly caught him at dawn. All he had left was a jammed Thompson, a combat knife, and this Springfield that felt wrong in his hands. The rifle was clean, oiled, precise, everything McNiece wasn't. Through the hayloft's shattered window, he could see the Germans dug into the barn ruins. Shadows behind collapsed stone, the MG-42's barrel protruding through a gap in masonry. Occasional movement, a helmet, a rifle muzzle, the silhouette of a soldier shifting position. They were disciplined, patient, conserving ammunition. They knew the Americans were boxed. Below in the farmhouse cellar, McNiece could hear voices. Sergeant Chuck Plauder, his best friend, the man who'd vouched for him when every officer in the 506th wanted him court-martialed for insubordination, was down there. So were 7 others, exhausted, terrified, running low on ammunition, waiting for something, anything, to break the stalemate. McNiece checked the Springfield's chamber. 17 rounds. He'd fired expert on the range at Benning, then promptly forgotten everything except how to wire bridges and blow roadblocks. He wasn't a sniper. He was the guy who made things explode. But right now, in this specific corner of Normandy's brutal hedgerow country, precision was the only tool he had left. The first German rifleman moved, just slightly, adjusting his position behind a pile of rubble, and McNiece exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger, and discovered what silence cost. The Springfield cracked once. Across the corridor, the Germans slumped sideways. The MG-42 roared in response, tearing apart the hayloft's far corner. Splinters exploded. Hay dust filled the air like fog. McNiece rolled left, pressed flat against the floorboards, heart hammering so hard he thought the Germans might hear it through the walls. This wasn't demolition work. This was something colder, something that required him to become still, patient, invisible, something that went against every instinct he'd built in 2 years of blowing things up and running. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. Part 2. The mission had been simple on paper. 2 days earlier, at a makeshift command post in a shot-up church basement near Carentan, a young lieutenant with maps that didn't match the ground had briefed McNiece's squad on their objective: scout the road network west of town, identify German positions, demolish any bridges or culverts that might support enemy armor moving toward the beachhead. Standard airborne work, except nothing in Normandy was standard. The night drop scattered them across flooded fields and hedgerows. Half the filthy 13 landed miles from the designated zone. Equipment bundles vanished into swamps or hung tangled in trees. McNiece's own chute caught in an orchard, and he'd cut himself free just as German voices drifted through the pre-dawn darkness. He'd moved alone since then, carrying nothing but a Thompson that jammed after 3 rounds, and the knowledge that his men were somewhere out there, scattered like seeds in the bocage. When he finally found the farmhouse, recognizing it from the briefing maps as a rally point, he'd expected to regroup, gather supplies, push toward the demolition targets. Instead, he found Plowder and 7 others trapped by a German squad that had occupied the barn ruins overnight. The Germans had arrived first. They'd set up the MG-42 to cover the corridor, positioned riflemen in overlapping fields of fire, and waited. When the American paratroopers tried to use the farmhouse as cover, the ambush caught them halfway. 2 men died in the first burst. The rest made it to the cellar, but the corridor, the only way out, became a death trap. McNiece had watched it unfold from the tree line, watched Plowder organize a rush, watched the machine gun erase it. That's when he'd climbed into the loft, found the Springfield, and made a choice that felt like betraying everything he knew about war. Demolitions were immediate. You rigged the charge, set the timer, ran. The explosion either worked or it didn't. There was clarity in that, a brutal simplicity. You didn't have to watch each individual result. You didn't have to see faces. But this, McNiece shifted position in the loft, moving slowly, silently, scanning the barn ruins through the Springfield sights. The Germans were invisible now, hunkered down after his first shot, waiting, listening, trying to figure out where the American sniper was hiding. He had 16 rounds left. From the cellar, Plowder's voice drifted up, hoarse, desperate, calling McNiece's name. The other paratroopers were arguing about whether to try another rush, whether to wait for nightfall, whether anyone was even coming to help them. Fear made their voices sharp. McNiece didn't answer, couldn't. Speaking would give away his position. And right now, invisibility was the only advantage he had. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Oklahoma, years ago, before the war. His father teaching him to hunt deer in the pine woods. Patience, the old man had said. Don't rush the shot. Let the animal forget you're there. McNiece had hated hunting, preferred dynamite fishing, loud, fast, effective. His father called it wasteful. They'd argued. McNiece had left home at 17, bounced between jobs, joined the army looking for structure, and found the airborne instead. Now, in a hayloft in Normandy, covered in dust and fear, he understood what his father meant. Across the corridor, the new MG-42 gunner shifted, just slightly, adjusting the belt feed. McNiece exhaled, squeezed, felt the Springfield buck against his shoulder. Shot 2. The gunner collapsed. The Germans started yelling, sharp, panicked commands in a language McNiece didn't understand, but he understood the tone, confusion, fear, the realization that they were being picked apart by someone they couldn't see. He rolled to a new position, reloaded, waited. 15 rounds left, and 30 meters of corridor still to clear. Part 3. Minutes stretched into hours, or maybe just minutes. McNiece couldn't tell anymore. Time moved differently when you were waiting for someone to make a mistake you could kill them for. Shot 3, a rifleman trying to reposition behind fallen timber, down. Shot 4, an assistant gunner reaching for the MG-42, down. The Germans stopped moving, stopped talking. The corridor fell into a silence heavier than shellfire, broken only by distant artillery rumbling somewhere toward Utah Beach, and the occasional crack of the Springfield echoing through the Normandy hedgerows. McNiece's hands were shaking now, not from fear, though there was plenty of that, but from holding the same position too long, from the adrenaline crash between shots, from the growing weight of what he was doing. Each pull of the trigger felt colder than the last, more deliberate, more final. This wasn't like demolition work. When you blew a bridge, you didn't see individual faces. You just saw the structure collapse, heard the thunder, moved to the next objective, but through the Springfield sights, McNiece saw everything. The boy loading the machine gun belt, fumbling with nervous hands, the sergeant barking orders, trying to hold his squad together, the rifleman who kept glancing toward the road, maybe thinking about retreat, maybe about home. And then McNiece pulled the trigger, and they stopped being people with thoughts and fears and just became problem solved. From the cellar, Plowder's voice cut through the silence. "That's a Springfield." One of the other paratroopers, a kid from Tennessee whose name McNiece couldn't remember, said something panicked about friendly fire, about being caught in a sniper duel, about getting out before the whole farmhouse came down. But Plowder knew. McNiece could hear it in his voice. "McNasty's up there," Plowder said quietly. "He's clearing the corridor." Relief flooded through the cellar. Hoarse laughter, whispered prayers, someone saying McNiece's name like a saint's. They thought salvation had arrived. They thought this was going to be easy now. McNiece wanted to shout down to them that it wasn't easy, that he had 12 rounds left and at least 5 Germans still dug into the barn ruins, that every shot was a guess, that he was terrified and exhausted and one mistake away from getting everyone killed. But he stayed silent. Let them believe. That's when the radio crackled. A runner from another unit, moving through the hedgerows, stopped outside the farmhouse long enough to relay news. The 506th had lost 20 men trying to take a similar position 2 kilometers north. Another squad from the 502nd got wiped out at a culvert crossing. The whole sector west of Carrington was a meat grinder, and regiment was pulling units back, consolidating, preparing for a German counterattack everyone knew was coming. No reinforcements, no relief, no resupply. Which meant McNiece had to finish this with what he had. A borrowed rifle, 12 rounds, and whatever passed for courage when your hands wouldn't stop shaking. Shot 7, a sergeant trying to rally his men, down. Shot 8, a rifleman breaking cover to grab ammunition, down. 10 rounds left, 3 Germans still holding the barn. And McNiece's right shoulder was starting to bruise from the Springfield's recoil. His eyes watering from squinting through the sights, his throat dry as the Normandy dust settling over everything. Would you follow the orders exactly? Or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Part 4. The MG-42 came back to life. A third German, younger than the others, maybe 18, had crawled through the rubble to take the gunner's position. McNiece watched him struggle with the belt feed, hands shaking, probably terrified, definitely untrained. The kid kept glancing back toward his surviving squadmates, looking for guidance, for orders, for someone to tell him this was going to be okay. McNiece didn't give him time to figure it out. Shot 9. The kid collapsed over the machine gun. Silence again. Heavier now. The kind of silence that made McNiece's ears ring, made him hyper-aware of his own breathing, his heartbeat, the creak of the floorboards beneath him every time he shifted position. 8 rounds left, 2 Germans remaining. From the cellar, Plowder was shouting, raw, desperate, begging McNiece to hurry, to finish it, to do something. One of the trapped paratroopers was hit, bleeding from shrapnel that had ricocheted during the earlier fighting, not dying, but suffering. And the June heat was turning the cellar into an oven. McNiece wiped sweat from his eyes, blinked away the sting, tried to steady his breathing. His shoulder throbbed, his hands cramped around the Springfield stock. Every muscle in his body screamed for movement, for action, for anything but this frozen, patient hunting that went against everything he'd trained for as a demolition man. Demolitions were about momentum. You moved fast, rigged the charge, got out. Sniper work was the opposite. Stillness stretched to the breaking point, waiting for the enemy to forget you existed. And McNiece was running out of time. The 2 remaining Germans weren't moving. They'd learned. They'd seen their squad picked apart by an invisible shooter. And now they were dug in deep behind the best cover in the barn ruins. Stone walls thick enough to stop rifle rounds, sight lines that covered the entire corridor. Professional soldiers, experienced, patient. McNiece could wait them out, maybe, but the paratrooper bleeding in the cellar couldn't, and if German reinforcements arrived before he finished this, everyone died. So he changed tactics. He fired shot 10 into the rubble near one German's position, not trying to hit, just trying to force movement to create an opening. The round sparked off stone. Nothing. Shot 11, same strategy. Still nothing. 6 rounds left, and McNiece was burning ammunition he couldn't afford to waste. That's when he heard it. Boots on cobblestone. Somewhere beyond the barn, out on the farm road leading back toward Carentan, a German patrol was approaching. Maybe investigating the gunfire. Maybe just bad timing. Either way, McNiece had minutes at most before this farmhouse became a battleground he couldn't control. The trapped paratroopers heard it too. Panic erupted in the cellar, voices overlapping, arguing about whether to surrender, to fight, to try running through the corridor regardless of the Germans still holding it. Plowder's voice cut through the chaos. "McNasty, we're out of time." McNiece knew. His hands tightened on the Springfield. 5 rounds left, 2 hidden Germans, and the sound of enemy reinforcements getting closer with every second. Then, finally, one of the Germans moved. Just slightly, rising a few inches to scan the hayloft, trying to locate the American sniper who'd been silent too long. McNiece didn't think, didn't aim carefully, just squeezed the trigger on instinct. Muscle memory from 100 range days he'd barely paid attention to. Shot 12. The German dropped, 1 enemy left, 4 rounds remaining, and the sound of boots on the farm road getting louder. The last rifleman knew he was alone now. McNiece could hear him. Panicked breathing, the scrape of boots on stone, the metallic click of a Kar 98K bolt sliding home. The man was maybe 19, maybe 20, and he'd watched his entire squad die in 30 minutes of methodical, invisible killing. And McNiece was about to make him the 8th. Part 5. The last German broke. McNiece tracked him through the Springfield sights, a clear shot, maybe 50 meters. The man silhouetted against daylight as he scrambled backward through the barn ruins, abandoning his rifle, running for his life. Center mass. Easy. McNiece had made harder shots all morning. His finger rested on the trigger, squeezed halfway, felt the familiar resistance before the break point, and stopped. He let the German run. Not because it was tactical, not because he was saving ammunition. Not because of the approaching patrol, or the trapped men in the cellar, or any of the reasons he'd tell himself later, in the long nights when the memory came back uninvited. He let the kid run, because McNiece's hands wouldn't stop shaking, because his shoulder was bruised raw from recoil, because something in his chest had gone cold and hollow after shot 12, and he was terrified that if he pulled the trigger one more time, he'd become something he couldn't walk away from. The German disappeared into the hedgerows, gone. The corridor was silent. McNiece descended from the hayloft slowly, legs trembling, the Springfield heavy in his hands like it had gained weight with every round fired. He crossed the open ground expecting fire, expecting the German patrol to materialize, expecting something to punish him for the choice he'd just made. Nothing happened. Plowder and the others stumbled out of the cellar, faces blackened with powder residue, uniforms soaked with sweat and fear. They stared at McNiece like he was something unfamiliar, something other. One of them started to speak, to say, "Thank you," or "Well done," or something that would have made it worse. McNiece handed the Springfield to Plowder. "Keep it," he muttered. "I'm done." Plowder didn't ask what he meant. Maybe he understood. Maybe he'd seen something in McNiece's eyes that explained everything without words. The kind of exhaustion that came from more than 18 hours moving through Normandy's hedgerows alone. The kind that came from killing 7 men, no, 8 men, because the scout who died holding this rifle counted 2, in 30 minutes of cold, patient work that felt nothing like demolitions and everything like something McNiece didn't want to name. The wounded paratrooper was conscious, stable enough to move. They rigged a stretcher from barnwood and parachute silk, gathered what ammunition they could salvage, and prepared to evacuate before the German patrol arrived. Nobody mentioned the last rifleman. Nobody asked why McNiece had stopped shooting before the corridor was completely clear. Maybe they assumed he'd run out of targets. Maybe they didn't want to know. Years later, intelligence officers would write a report. Dry, impersonal language. Enemy position neutralized through precision rifle fire. Corridor secured. 8 friendly personnel recovered. No mention of McNiece by name. No mention of the Springfield or the hayloft or the 17 rounds. No mention that the most notorious demolition man in the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment had saved 8 men using a weapon he barely knew and patience he didn't think he had. And definitely no mention that he'd let the last enemy soldier run because something inside him, something fundamental, had reached its limit and refused to go further. The official story would call it a successful combat action in the Normandy hedgerows near Carentan. McNiece would call it the day he learned that silence had a cost higher than any explosion, and that some weights never stop pressing down, no matter how many years pass. Part 6. The German patrol never came. Maybe the rifleman McNiece let run warned them off. Maybe they heard the sudden silence and decided discretion beat glory. Maybe it was just luck, the kind of random, meaningless luck that kept some men alive while others died for no reason at all. Either way, McNiece and the rescued paratroopers made it back to American lines by nightfall, moving through the bocage country in the purple dusk that softened the hedgerows and made the burned-out vehicles along the roads look almost peaceful. At the aid station, a medic treated McNiece's shoulder. Deep bruising from the Springfield's recoil, nothing serious. The doc made a joke about demolition men not being built for sniper work, prescribed rest, moved on to the next casualty. Nobody asked McNiece how it felt. Nobody asked what he saw through those sights. Plowder tried, once. They were sitting outside a tent, smoking, watching replacements arrive, fresh-faced kids who hadn't jumped yet, hadn't learned what Normandy would teach them. Plowder started to say something about the farmhouse, about the corridor, about what McNiece had done up in that hayloft. McNiece cut him off. Don't. That was all. Just don't. And Plowder, who'd known him long enough to understand, nodded and let it drop. But the other men didn't. The story spread through the 506th like smoke, exaggerated, simplified, turned into legend. Some versions had McNiece killing a dozen Germans. Some had him holding off an entire company. None of them mentioned his hands shaking or the hollow feeling in his chest or the kid he'd let run. None of them mentioned that he'd almost missed shot 6, or that shot 10 was blind luck, or that he'd spent the whole engagement terrified he was about to get everyone killed. Legends were lighter than memories, easier to carry. 6 weeks later, McNiece was back to demolitions, rigging bridges, blowing roadblocks, working with TNT and detonation cord, and the brutal, immediate physics of explosions. He never picked up a Springfield again. Didn't need to. That was sniper work, and he was a demolition man. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between missions, he'd catch himself listening to the sounds around him differently. The way German soldiers moved through rubble, the rhythm of machine gun fire, the silence that came after someone stopped breathing, and sometimes, late at night, when artillery rumbled in the distance and the tent walls glowed orange from fires nobody could put out, he'd think about the kid he let run. Wonder if the boy made it home. Wonder if he told his own version of the story about the day an American paratrooper could have killed him and chose not to. Wonder if that choice made McNiece weak or human, and whether there was a difference. December 1987. 43 years after Normandy, Jake McNiece, 65 years old, gray-haired, arthritic, stood on a train platform in Oklahoma, waiting for his grandson to arrive for Christmas. The freight train rumbled through, rattling the old wooden boards beneath his feet, and for a moment the sound brought him back. Hedgerows, dust, the crack of a rifle echoing through ruined farm buildings. His hands tightened on the platform railing. The train passed. The present returned. His grandson, 12 years old, obsessed with World War II stories, would ask about Normandy again, about the Filthy 13, about the things McNiece did that got written up in history books and embroidered into myths. And McNiece would tell him the safe stories, the funny ones, the ones about parachute malfunctions and stubborn officers and the time the whole squad got drunk before a general inspection. He wouldn't mention the farmhouse, wouldn't mention 17 rounds or 8 men saved, or the weight of the Springfield in his hands. Wouldn't mention the kid he let run, and how that single moment of mercy or weakness or exhaustion, he still didn't know which, had haunted him longer than all the bridges he'd blown combined, because some truths weren't meant for history books, some weights you carried alone. And sometimes the most important thing you ever did was the thing you chose not to do. The shot you didn't take, the silence you let settle, the 17 rounds that cleared a corridor, and the one that proved you were still human underneath the uniform, and the legend and the fear. The M1903 Springfield, rust-spotted now, forgotten in some military depot or private collection, had taught Jake McNiece that silence could hit harder than any explosion. It was a lesson he carried to his grave. Udil, if this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.